The recipe the world almost erased. It nearly vanished without noise or resistance. No final protest. No official farewell. Just a recipe quietly slipping out of use, until one day it existed only in fragments of memory and half-written notes. And if not for a single, stubborn decision, the world would have lost it forever. The recipe belonged to no famous restaurant. It wasn't celebrated, photographed, or ranked. It lived in homes, in back kitchens, in places where food was made to sustain rather than impress. For generations, it had been passed hand to hand, adjusted instinctively, never written down completely. That informality was its strength, and eventually, its greatest vulnerability. As the world modernized, the recipe became inconvenient. It took too long. It required ingredients that didn't travel well. It depended on judgment instead of precision. Cooking schools didn't teach it. Suppliers didn't support it. And slowly, quietly, people stopped making it. Not because they disliked it, but because the world stopped leaving room for it. To understand how close it came to disappearing, we must return to the moment when one cook realized something was wrong. He was preparing a version of the dish from memory, following steps he had watched since childhood. But when he tasted it, something felt absent, not missing flavor, missing meaning. He realized he was cooking an echo, not the recipe itself. He began asking questions. He visited elders who still remembered the dish, each version slightly different, shaped by circumstance rather than instruction. Some remembered techniques no longer used. Others remembered why certain steps mattered, even if they couldn't explain how. Piece by piece, the cook understood what was happening. The recipe was not being forgotten. It was being simplified out of existence. And as he gathered those fragments, he realized the danger wasn't neglect. It was translation, turning something lived into something efficient. If that happened, the recipe would survive in name only. The cook made a choice that would change everything. He would cook the recipe exactly as it was meant to be cooked, slowly, imperfectly, and without permission. And in doing so, he would place himself directly in the path of a world that had already decided this recipe no longer belonged. He began in obscurity, cooking the recipe in borrowed kitchens and quiet homes. There was no announcement, no attempt to frame it as revival. He simply invited people to eat. The first reactions were confused. The dish did not match expectations shaped by modern versions. Textures were uneven. Flavors arrived in waves instead of balance. Some diners asked what went wrong. Nothing had. The cook explained that the recipe was never meant to be efficient. It was built around waiting, adjustment, and trust in senses rather than instructions. Heat changed based on sound. Timing shifted with humidity. Ingredients were chosen for character, not consistency. The recipe resisted control, and that resistance made people uneasy. Word spread slowly, and with it came pressure. Culinary advisors suggested documenting the recipe to save it properly. Publishers offered book deals, promising permanence. Institutions proposed certifications to protect authenticity. Each offer arrived wrapped in good intentions, but the cook recognized a pattern. Writing it down completely would freeze it. Standardizing it would hollow it. Protection would turn it into performance. He refused. Instead, he invited others to cook alongside him, not to learn steps, but to learn attention. He corrected hands, not notes. He explained why mistakes mattered. He insisted that every version would be different, and that difference was the point. Some cooks left frustrated. Others stayed, unsettled but curious. Resistance followed. Critics questioned whether such a fluid recipe could truly be preserved. Educators warned that without documentation, it would disappear again. Some accused the cook of gatekeeping, of withholding knowledge that belonged to everyone. The pressure mounted to prove legitimacy, to justify refusal, to translate the recipe into something the modern world could recognize. The cook felt the strain. Teaching this way was slow and exhausting. There were no shortcuts, no proof of progress. And yet, something undeniable was happening. Those who learned did not replicate the recipe. They carried it. They cooked it in new places, adapting without losing its core. The dish began appearing again, not as a copy, but as a living form. Still, the conflict sharpened. A culinary council announced plans to archive endangered recipes, including this one. They requested the cook's cooperation, framing the archive as a final safeguard against loss. The invitation was formal, urgent, and difficult to refuse. Declining would label him irresponsible. Accepting would surrender the recipe to a system that had already nearly erased it. The cook stood at crossroads. If he refused, the world might forget again. If he agreed, the recipe would survive, but as something unrecognizable. The next choice would determine whether the recipe remained alive in practice or preserved into silence. The council meeting was quiet, procedural, almost respectful. They spoke of preservation, of safeguarding cultural memory against loss. Charts were presented, timelines outlined. The recipe would be documented, standardized, archived, and made accessible for future generations. They promised fidelity. They promised care. The cook listened patiently. When it was his turn to speak, he did not argue against preservation. He argued against certainty. He explained that the recipe did not survive because it was written. It survived because people felt responsible for it. Once that responsibility was transferred to an institution, the recipe would no longer belong to those who cooked it. It would belong to those who managed it. The room grew uneasy. Some council members countered that without documentation, knowledge decays. That memory is unreliable. That culture needs anchors. The cook agreed, then asked who would adjust the recipe when seasons changed, when ingredients evolved, when lives demanded improvisation. Who would decide what was correct when correctness itself was the enemy? Silence followed. The council postponed their decision, but the pressure intensified outside the room. Articles framed the cook as reckless. Commentators accused him of romanticizing loss. Social debates erupted over access versus authenticity. The recipe, once nearly forgotten, now stood at the center of an argument about who gets to decide how culture survives. Meanwhile, the cook continued teaching. Those who stayed learned not just how to make the dish, but how to carry it forward. They cooked it imperfectly, then cooked it again. They failed publicly and adjusted privately. They learned that fidelity did not mean repetition. It meant attention. Slowly, a network formed, not official, not visible, but resilient. Then the council announced their final ruling. The recipe would be archived, with or without the cook's participation. The declaration felt final. Authority had chosen certainty over trust. The cook understood that refusal would not stop the archive. It would only remove his voice from it. And yet, participation would legitimize a version of the recipe he did not believe in. That night, alone in the kitchen, he prepared the dish one last time for himself. He cooked without witnesses, without correction, without defense. As he tasted it, he felt clarity settle in. The recipe did not need protection. It needed people willing to be changed by it. The final decision was coming, one that would decide whether the recipe would be remembered as a document or continue living quietly, beyond the reach of those trying to save it. The cook declined participation in the archive. No public statement, no open letter, just a quiet refusal delivered with respect. The council proceeded without him, publishing a version of the recipe that looked complete, precise, and lifeless. It was praised for clarity. It was taught. It was replicated. And it tasted like nothing he remembered. But the recipe did not disappear. It continued moving through kitchens the archive could not reach, through hands that had learned attention instead of instruction. Those cooks adjusted instinctively, as they had been taught. They cooked for people who understood waiting. The dish returned to tables not as a preserved artifact, but as an experience that changed with time, weather, and need. Over years, two versions of the recipe existed side by side. One lived on paper. One lived in practice. Students learned the archive version and moved on, but those who encountered the living one stopped. They asked questions without answers. They cooked more slowly. They failed more often and learned more deeply. The recipe shaped them, not the other way around. Eventually, something quiet but telling happened. Cooks trained only on the documented version began seeking out those who carried the living one. They sensed the difference immediately, not in flavor alone, but in posture, in patience, in how the dish was treated. The archive had preserved form. The kitchens had preserved meaning. The council's version never vanished. It still exists neat and accessible, but it no longer defines a recipe. It is a reference, not a source. The real lineage flows elsewhere, unrecorded, adaptive, and resilient. The cook never corrected the archive. He never criticized it publicly. He understood that not everything worth saving can be secured by systems designed for certainty. Some things survive only when entrusted to people. The recipe the world almost erased did not survive because it was protected. It survived because it was carried. And that may be the most fragile and powerful form of preservation we have. Subscribe to join the journey.